Come on, one more time for Brooke. Keep that applause going for Bryan Kett. Bryan Kett.
I went to a very small liberal arts school on the Mississippi River, and as an undergrad in the dorms, alcohol was prohibited. So social life depended upon house parties, and these house parties were invite only, and I never had an invite. But what I did have was a real passion for science. So instead, I would spend my nights in the library where I would learn about the periodic table and how plant roots worked. But what really captured my interest was the class I took called zoology, the study of animals. And I would sit there and I would pore over these diagrams of creatures that seemed mythological. And I learned the taxonomies of each. That's the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And some of these organisms demonstrated parasitism, where as parasites, they would latch on to a host organism and drain the host of its nutrients and its life force. And other organisms, performed mutualism, where they actually benefited by having something to offer the organisms around them. And mutualism was something that I personally pined for in a social sense. Especially with the campus alpha. The guy lived on my floor. His name was Tim. Cool Tim. Cool Tim was an athlete. Cool Tim was in Greek life. And girls wanted Cool Tim, and guys, including me, wanted to be Cool Tim. Until one night, when everyone was in the dorm lounge watching football and I was off to the side studying zoology. Cool Tim burst in right out of the shower. His towel was still wrapped around his waist, and he was dripping water everywhere, and his eyes were the size of dinner plates. And with a tremble in his voice that had never been there before, he said, "You guys want to hear something messed up?" and obviously we all did. It was Cool Tim. It's like, "What's up, Cool Tim? What's going on?" And just terrified and looking for answers, he said, "In the shower just now, this crawled out of me," and he held up in his hand what looked like a translucent bean sprout, except it was 1.5 feet long, and it was thrashing back and forth. Nobody spoke. The only thing that moved was this creature that he was holding, and people looked away, but I looked closer. The tapering at both ends, the cream-colored exterior, this banding pattern, I knew what it was. I had something to offer. What he was holding was not a chordate. It did not have a backbone. But in that moment, I did. And I announced to the room that what we were dealing with here was an intestinal roundworm, genus and species Ascaris lumbricoides, and given its size, it was a female. And the entire room turned to me. And it was for the first time everybody actually saw me. Mutualism. And Cool Tim just stood there, worm in hand, still stunned because he just grew and lost a tail in the shower. So I picked up an empty cup of ramen noodles and I gave it to him so he could hold his former tenant, I guess is what you would call that. And then I sent the two of them to the hospital. And it was there he learned that he got his worm from eating vegetables that weren't washed properly. But when he got back to campus, everybody heard about his worm, but they also heard about that other guy who was there. That guy who knew what it was, that guy who sent Cool Tim to the hospital, the guy who maybe even saved Cool Tim's life. And this made such a resounding impact on campus that I got invited to a house party. And I was there for about an hour. I was tired, standing awkwardly by the keg, not knowing what to do or who to talk to, when a bunch of people went over to Cool Tim and wanted to know about his worm, asking, was it true? And he said it was. He didn't give many details, but I did. Graphic details, scientific details, and everyone loved it. So from that point on, I just latched on to Cool Tim, and wherever he went, so did I. And I'd bring up this worm, and people loved it, and this got me invited to other house parties, and at those other house parties, I became the center of attention, and Cool Tim would just stand off to the side. You know, he had become regular Tim. And life was amazing. So it was a few weeks later, I was studying for my zoology final, and I was reviewing my notes on parasites and parasitism when I realized that I wasn't just reading about Tim's worm, I was reading about myself. I was a parasite. I was a social parasite, and I wasn't siphoning nutrients from Tim. I was siphoning coolness and popularity and clout. And while this was totally great for me, you know, it wasn't fair to him. The guy had been through enough. And so I knew then and there that I had to do the right thing. I had to crawl out. And so I stopped letting his worm be my social crutch. And anytime anyone brought it up, with this newfound confidence I had, I would change the subject. And sooner or later, people stopped asking me, was it true? And started asking, how are you? I didn't need Tim anymore. And on my way to my final, I stopped off in the cafeteria for a bite to eat, and I saw all these people there that I'd met at these house parties. And it made me so happy, you know, and I just couldn't wait to go over and say hello. And, you know, not just because I had made all these new friends, but because I knew full well that even if a parasite leaves one host, it can always find another.